It was a battle for the soul of whiskey. I told you I would talk to you about this. This is Whiskey Nerd History. This is the 1909 Royal Commission to determine what is and what wasn't whiskey in the UK and Ireland. Well, at the time it was all UK. Or all run by England, basically. Oh, okay. We'll talk about this in a second, but like this right here, this little glass top, this is really cool, interesting, unique. Then you try to open it and you're like, I can't get a handle on the, it was the Waterford guys who have this glass top cork that showed me that with these little glass top rubber sealed tops, if you just push against it, it just pops right out with no effort. So I can thank the Waterford crew for that little trick. Okay, so, whoa, bonky. I shouldn't, that just caught me off guard. Okay, so what happens is, originally all whiskey was some version of pot still, around the whole world. Anyone making anything that could be even close to what we know of as whiskey was using pot still distillation. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and modern machinery that we start getting new inventions like patent stills and column stills, which are all sort of in the same category. It's continuous rectification and plates and things like this. And what it did, one, was allow you to distill constantly. So if you have a pot still, you fill it, you run it for 8, 12, 15 hours, you empty it, you clean it, you fill it, you run it. That's a lot of work. You have a column where you input beer in one end and at the other end out comes spirit, and you can run that forever as long as you got beer to put into it. And so the invention of the patent still and the column still is, Robert Stein and NAS Coffee, this revolutionized the whiskey industry. All of a sudden, early 1830s, 1820s, things are flying. And all these malt guys are making big, heavy, malted whiskeys, which are flavorful and sometimes inconsistent and drama. And then you've got these guys producing what's not quite vodka, but it's more like vodka than it is like pot still whiskey. And they can do it fast, so they're flooding the market with all of these things. And there's sort of, and this is the origin of blending history and Dewar's and Johnny Walker and so on. And what it is what the blenders would say is, we took this sometimes inconsistent malt product and blended it with our, grain whiskey, which they didn't use at the time, it was all just whiskey, and to sort of a continuous, consistent flavor profile. Anyway, they didn't like each other. And the people who liked them least, actually, were the Irish pot still whiskey makers and the Irish malt makers. And so it's so big that in the late 1800s, a group of four, John Jameson, William Jameson and Co., John Power and Son, and George Rowe and Co., all get together, based out of Dublin, and they publish a book called The Truths About Whiskey. And they basically explain how that's grain bullshit that those guys are making isn't whiskey. Now, the downside is they're up against Distillers Company Limited, DCL, which eventually becomes United and then Diageo. And they're a blending operation who had bought up all these lowland Scotch distillers and either shuttered them or moved them into being components of their blends. And they had a lot of money at stake. And so keep in mind, 1878, 1880s, this is around the same era that in America you're dealing with rectifiers, and people like Colonel E.H. Taylor are helping try to come up with a plan for things like bottled and bond, where they put restrictions around what is and isn't whiskey. Remember when I said like last year in a video, I think good ideas live in the air, and people who are paying attention, an idea's time just shows up? This is one of those. If you look into around the Industrial Revolution and late 1800s, you find people all over the world trying to refine in the whiskey industry what is and isn't real. And a number of Highland distillers took a stand against DCL, even though DCL was their main purchaser for most of them. That is risky. And so there was just sort of, as a matter of fact, even at one point in the early 1900s, Andrew Mackenzie, who was the owner of Dalmore, he was talking to a group of people, customers, and he said, I'm going to read his quote. He said, once one gets initiated to pure Highland malt, or self whiskey, that is the product of one distillery, it's invariably preferred to the best of blends. But it requires a little education at first with people who have never taken it before. Oh man, that's so... Anytime you end up in a conversation with makers where they want to educate the customer, you know you're on the side of the losing battle. I'm just saying, as a marketing communications guy and a business guy, the moment you're a business owner, his whole approach is to educate the consumer, you know you're on the losing side. This is not just true in business, also true in other things. I'll leave it at that. But I'm going to tell you about the one moment that sort of drew the line in the sand and gave us grain and blends forever in Scotland. And it happens in 1905 in the Islington Borough Council. But first, let's drink some of this whiskey. This is a product, I was walking down the aisle, I looked up in the Irish section, I was like, what in the world is that? Limavady. Limavady. Single malt whiskey. It's Irish whiskey, by the way. And I was like, what? I've never even heard of this. And I pulled it up the shelf. That's a weird looking bottle. And I looked on the back and it says, product of Ireland, imported by Whistle Pig. And now I'm like, okay, Whistle Pig Rye, Vermont, Canadian sourcing. Whistle Pig's now in the business of working with somebody for Irish whiskey. What the hell's going on here? And so I brought it back and I did some basic research. And my favorite write-up was on Dramface from Archibald Grampian from, so it's a Northern Ireland product. And it's on Dramface, the website that does reviews. Anyway, and what he said was Limavady is a small market town not far from his neck of the woods in Northern Ireland. Like 12,000 people, and the name of the town derives from Irish Gaelic word that, when you say it, sounds like Limavady. And it translates to leap of the dog. And the storyline is evidently that, like, at some point a clan was being attacked and a dog jumped into the river and went and got help, like Lassie. And so on the front it says at the bottom, leap of the dog. But then he went further, Archibald did, to explain, and I couldn't find this information many places, so thank you. Great resource, Dramface. Daryl McNally of Bushmills fame became the head distiller at Dublin Liberties Distillery, which is a new operation in Dublin relative to all the old brands. And this is his newest venture, Limavady. And in theory, the whiskey is likely coming from Northern British whiskey distillery, which was John Cooley's next project after he sold off the Cooley distillery to Beam Suntory, and then his sons used whiskey stock to start tealing in Dublin. And it's coming into the US, probably through its connection with Whistle Pig. That's a guess. The nose. This is single malt, not pot still, single malt Irish whiskey. And it is funky applesauce. This is young, this is malt, this is wide cut malt funk. As a matter of fact, I am regularly calling stuff malt funk in tastings and on these videos. And I was doing a tasting with somebody the other day, one-on-one, and I described malt funk, and they were like, what is that? And so I went and grabbed a new make, unaged malt barley spirit, and I said, smell this. See how it smells funky? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, yes, you can smell that in this. So it has the aged components, and it has the fruit notes of fermentation gave to it, but it also has some of the grain aspects that come with a barley spirit that give it this sort of like vaguely, as Sir Richard Patterson calls it, baby sick. And it's just this sour, slightly tangy, funky grain note that to my brain says young spirit. Not immature, just young. And it has got that in spades. This is not your blended Irish whiskey. Super fruity, little grain funk, a lot of vanilla, crawling in on floral almost. Oh, very soft in the palate, kind of creamy, and then a little bit of a sour tang to the end of the finish. Whew. Interesting. I don't know that it would change your life, but it's good. It's well made. and it's an interesting spirit. Said on the bottle that it was finished in bourbon barrels and PX sherry barrels, triple distilled, but it calls it single barrel Irish whiskey, and it's only 46%. A single barrel is, I would argue that that's not a thing. That, yeah, it might have come from one finished barrel, sure, but like, if you just named two kinds of barrels, then you combined some whiskey into that barrel as you were finishing it. And I think that's fine. But in the American market, that's going to be confusing. How do you have, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm just being nitpicky. But it's not, in American whiskey, when you say single barrel, it usually means start to finish one barrel. And that's not this. This is bourbon, then probably PX sherry. And probably a few bourbon barrels going in to fill the PX sherry, which is very common and makes great whiskey. But it's a little weird in the American market for that term. I'm getting acclimated to the barley, I'm getting acclimated to the barley funk, and it's softening into just like red apple, caramel candy apple, vanilla cream. I'm liking it more the more I sip on it. I'm gonna let this sit a little bit. I'm gonna add a little water, even though it's at 46. So, 1905, the Islington Borough Council. There are a couple of unscrupulous publicans, pub owners, merchants, who realized that they could swap the majority of their malt whiskey with a grain and just leave the label malt on it and like, it's fine, guys. Sounds a lot like the rectifiers in America, doesn't it? And people were getting fed up with it. And so fed up that people complained, and the council of Islington Borough Council got involved, and there was basically a lawsuit placed, and the magistrate who oversaw the lawsuit saying, is this or isn't whiskey? And basically it was a fraud case, which said, I ordered whiskey, and what I was given was this grain stuff, so I've been defrauded. Whoa. Okay, that sounds like a small case, and Islington's not a big city. It's a small city. And this is a battle that's happening across multiple countries. And all of a sudden, this one tiny little enclave of Islington is like, we're going to answer this once and for all. And the magistrate that they put it before, was a prohibitionist. His name is Edward Snow Fordham. And he was a prohibitionist and had previously railed against fraudulent brandy, actually. So he was already like, yeah, let's get these guys. This is not right. And they rule that it's not whiskey. Immediately, the whiskey industry goes into an uproar. The malt guys and the Irish guys are like, yes, we told you. And then DCL, who has all the money and is making most of its whiskey income from grain column still production and blending, goes on the warpath. And they go on the warpath by creating massive marketing campaigns where they market and promote only grain whiskey. And their first marketing campaign says, 7-year-old Cambus patent still, which is grain whiskey. A national press campaign in 1906. And what they say in the campaign is, Cambus is not pot still whiskey, unlike that headache in a bottle or headache in a gallon whiskey from the Highland makers. Cambus column still whiskey is pure and purified, unlike that crap Highland malt. Whoa! And then the malt guys put out the dangers of the silent spirit. Like they go into the public war in the way that you did in that time, which was like publishing books and treatises and pamphlets and putting advertisements in magazines. But eventually it becomes such a big deal that a royal commission gets appointed, which is sort of like a committee, like in the US, a government committee gets appointed to solve this problem once and for all. And they listen to all the sides, and they look at who's spending most of the money. This doesn't say that, but I'm just saying who's got the most money in that conversation. And they come out of that and they conclude after 37 sittings, which by the way, the commission mostly made up of non-whiskey drinkers. And they decide once and for all, grain whiskey is whiskey. And the only requirement for whiskey in Scotland, and then this rolled across to Ireland because they owned, they were in charge of Ireland at the time. This is before the, Irish independence. Whiskey is a spirit obtained by distillation. They don't determine what kind of distillation, from a wash saccharified, which is like fermented, by the diastase of malt, which is basically no additional enzymes. You just use malted barley to ferment something. And that's it. If it was distilled in Scotland, that's it. If you made a beer and you distilled it from grain in Scotland, it was whiskey. It didn't matter what the still you were using was. Overnight, bam! And there was also, they didn't name a minimum maturation, and they didn't name a minimum percentage of malt required in the blend. Huge victory for DCL and the patent and the stills and the column still guys. Huge victory. People were furious, by the way. The malt guys, furious. My favorite quote, oh, and this is starting to get more like, man, if you poured me in this and didn't tell me it was Irish, I might think it might be a really funky malty scotch. But the taste is very different. There's now sort of a citrusy biscuit note in there. Yeah, it's cool. Worth what I paid for it, which is somewhere in the $40 range. Not going to change my opinions on what I'm going to drink on a daily basis, but I enjoyed it. At one point, the Duke of Richmond and Gordon says this when he's speaking at Glenlivet about the Royal Commission's decision. He says, "For my part, I prefer, and I think that most of those who I'm addressing now would prefer to trust their own palates over the dogma of chemists." Witty repartee. But it lost. Why? Because they wanted to educate the consumer. And the patent guys weren't even trying. So that's how we ended up with grain whiskey and what America calls light whiskey being officially considered whiskey in Ireland and Scotland and England. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here. If you like almost 20-minute history lessons on nerdy whiskey topics, like and subscribe.